Taylor Laurent, for those who've attended before, and if not, welcome to your first technical workshop. I'm serving as the 2050 Metropolitan Transportation Plans Project Manager, and this 2050 MTP Technical Workshop series serves as our forum for focused and detailed group discussions on technical components of the 2050 plan, and we have a wide group of workshop participants. So we have representatives from Orange, Osceola, and Seminole counties, our 20 cities and towns, Links, the Florida Department of Transportation, Florida's Turnpike Enterprise, Central Florida Expressway Authority, our 3 airports, and the Federal Highway Administration, just to name a few. So we do have a bit of a shorter agenda today than we normally do, with most of our time being reserved today for polling and discussion. We'll begin with a brief overview of the ongoing work efforts to develop the MTP, briefly refresh ourselves on the work that's been completed to date to get us to this point in time, and then set the stage for our funding scenario discussions. So we will be reviewing the first 5 preliminary funding scenarios, summarizing some of the feedback that we received just yesterday at our 2050 MTP Summit. And then we're going to ask for your thoughts and open up the virtual floor for comments and discussion on all of the key themes that we heard from our summit yesterday. These topics will be followed by our public comment section and a review of our next steps for the 2050 MTP. So if you do have any questions during today's technical workshop, and I see we have about 50 participants now, so quite a number, please use the raise your hand feature or type your questions directly into the chat box or Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will be pausing periodically throughout the presentation to answer those questions. And if at some point, if time is running a little bit short, we'll save those questions for our open comment period towards the end of the meeting. So I thank you in advance for your understanding. So to get us started with our status updates, we are continuing our coordination with the Florida Department of Transportation Central Florida Regional Planning Model Team. There have been some slight schedule changes to the development of the regional planning model, and we're waiting to see what those new schedule elements will look like in their totality, as well as looking at a couple of the methodology components in parallel to that schedule update. So hopefully we'll have a little more information come our next technical workshop. And as a quick update on our technical reports, recommendations, and strategies, the vast majority of our technical analyses to get us to where we are today is concluded, which is a big milestone for the 2050 MTP. We're in the process of finalizing and addressing all of our final reports in terms of the technical reports and then what they will look like as they're published in the MTP document itself. So as those are completed, they will be published on our website. And then a few items that are coming soon, but wanted to let you all know about. The 2050 MTP locally funded or project or partner funded project lists, which are included in the 2050 MTP for planning consistency purposes. We're going to be starting with some coordination to develop those planning consistency lists within the next few weeks. So for each of our government agencies within the region, our transportation partners, please keep an eye out for emails from me so we can start that coordination and make sure that we have the projects you're working on or that are on your local needs lists but may not be eligible for Metro Plan Orlando funding, and we have those up to date so we can have that planning consistency within the region. Going into the last kind of coming soon item, I know we've mentioned in the past that we want to have a dashboard view to be able to look at all of the transportation project needs within the 3-county region that are eligible for Metro Plan Orlando funding. So the results of the needs assessment work that has been completed. That interactive dashboard is nearing its completion to be able to view those projects and their raw priority scores from the project prioritization methodology. That will be also coming soon and will be published live on our website in the coming weeks. And then a quick note, yesterday we had our 2050 MTP Summit to really focus in on some of the topics that we're going to talk about today, but in a long form edition. So that was for our our advisory committees and board members here at Metro Plan Orlando. We were able to really hear from our board chairman and executive directors, focus in on presentations for our 2050 MTP work and stakeholder feedback that we've received to date, which you will hear about today as well, and taking a first look at our illustrative funding scenarios. So the first 5 scenarios that have been developed to see kind of what the future could look like at MetroPlan Orlando with our funding, depending on which funding policies we develop collaboratively this year. We completed a small group table talk activity, uh, affectionately titled Making Money Move. We're going to focus in on that a little bit later in today's discussion. Then we had a report out and large group discussion to talk about the key themes and items that showed up not only in those small group activities, but what themes were common amongst multiple groups. So I believe we had well over 80 attendees yesterday, so it was very well attended, very well received, and we did have some excellent conversations yesterday. And you'll hear some of those key themes today, so you can give your thoughts as well. So with that, we're going to jump into our first topic for the agenda today, focusing in on how we got to where we are now. So our journey so far has been to really focus in on the key foundational elements of the 2050 plan's development. We've collaboratively established the MTP's goals, objectives, and measures. We've looked at and evaluated the existing conditions, future trends, and drivers of change, looked at regional freight travel, congestion management strategies, incorporated our planning emphasis areas of health, housing, and environment, as well as worked hand in hand with both you, our local government and operating partners, and the public to be able to reach this point where we are today. So what I'm really going to focus on as part of this prelude to our discussion this afternoon are 3 elements that we've recently completed as part of the MTP development process and how those funnel into the last item, the 4th one, of funding policy. So our needs assessment, as I kind of alluded to a little bit earlier, is how we have identified and documented the transportation needs within our 3-county area, what I usually refer to as our transportation to-do list. From there, we have developed a project prioritization methodology to be able to know which order in which we want to address those projects on our needs assessment list. And then we have our revenue forecasts, which serve as our budgetary control totals. So we know how much funding we have available to address the projects on our to-do list. So as all that comes together, we are brought back to where we are now, using all of this information to develop the funding policy, which is going to be our guide to how we spend the limited funding available within our region in a programmatic manner. So these funding scenarios are used to evaluate how changes in funding allocations within our region change the transportation projects that can actually be implemented. So as we review different funding scenarios this afternoon to test the various funding policies, we're going to be looking at very tangible comparisons between these various options to understand the implications of choosing one scenario versus another. Now today marks the beginning of our discussions with the summit yesterday and this afternoon, really focusing in on what those first 5 scenarios look like. And we're going to be developing and refining these funding scenarios throughout this year as we work to build consensus on a preferred funding scenario, which will be used to develop the MTP's cost feasible plan. We all know that transportation projects use a variety of funding sources to be able to get them from their initial idea to implementation and construction. And each of these 4 funding types, federal, state, local, and tolls, are all represented within the Metropolitan Transportation Plan within their respective sections. So as we talk about our transportation funding scenarios or our funding policy, we're going to be focusing in on one component of the federal funding category. So within the federal funding category, there's 2 general types of money here, those which are distributed directly to the state and FDOT, and then the urban attributable TMA funds, which are sub-allocated to MetroPlan Orlando and other MPOs. So as we develop this funding policy and evaluate the scenarios for the 2050 plan, we are going to be focusing exclusively on those MPO urban attributable funds for which the MPO has that funding authority. So our current funding policy is the recommended funding scenario from the 2045 plan. It is limited to those urban attributable TMA funds we were just discussing, and it divides the funding into four categories: complete streets, transit capital improvements, regional bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure, as well as transportation systems management and operational solutions, or TISMO. And we're really focusing in and spending a lot of time on these funding scenarios and this funding policy because it provides the structure to how projects are prioritized and programmed into our Transportation Improvement Program and the FDOT Work Program each year. The current approach, based on the 2045 plan, does allow for a greater number of projects to be implemented and a wider variety of projects due to the dedicated funding categories and dedicated sources of funding to particular modes of travel. So this policy also allows projects to flow pretty seamlessly through the MPO planning process as they begin in the MTP, are shortlisted on the prioritized project list, and ultimately programmed in our Transportation Improvement Program and FDOT's Work Program. And as we look to 2050, the funding policy that we collaboratively developed this year is going to be able to provide that same structure to each of our core products for at least the next 5 years. So we're going to be really focusing in on that to make sure that we have a policy that we have consensus around and we can implement together. So as we look at that particular question, what is the funding policy? We've been talking about this for a little while to get ready for today, asking you and the public some very poignant questions to make sure that we were setting ourselves up to be ready for this discussion. So those questions really followed along. Should there be fewer modal categories than what have been included in the past? Different modal categories? More than what we've included? Or should we change the funding amounts that are allocated to each of them? There's a variety of options that we could look at. And when we asked the public which of the modal categories should be included in the funding policy, all of the pro-offered options were considered important enough to include. And this includes the complete streets, active transportation, TISMO, transit capital, as well as safety, um, all of which have a 65% support level or greater. And as we looked deeper into the individual survey responses, there were common themes that did rise to the surface. From our public feedback, we saw a very strong emphasis on multimodal travel, a preference for dedicated funding for safety improvements and safety programs within our region, and a desire for additional transit services. In terms of our technical feedback, we saw some very similar themes, again, building towards consensus, which is what we like to see. We saw a similar focus on multimodal travel. Again, that emphasized need for dedicated funding for safety projects and a desire to incorporate more flexibility into the planning process. So before our summit yesterday, so we have a couple dates and timestamps here, we discussed all of these detailed survey results with our advisory committee and board members and kind of landed on some initial consensus on the rules that we were going to use to develop our first set of funding scenarios. So this includes making sure that we kept with the modal program approach for using the MPO federal funds, that we were going to use those federal funds to also include a safety category to allow them to be used for safety improvements on the state highway system via the 3R pavement resurfacing program. Not including a local match requirement, as well as not using MPO funds for local agency widening projects. And then note that the year of expenditure for each of the projects would be included within the work effort. So we were adjusting what that maximum funding limit for each particular project would be based on its year of expenditure. So with that, kind of walking through how we got to today, I'll turn the microphone over. Well, before I do that, actually, does anyone have any questions? If you do, please use the raise your hand feature or put your questions directly into the chat. All right, I see one hand is raised. Okay, Arturo, you're recognized.
Thank you. I was wondering the exercises that we had yesterday at the summit.
Mhm.
Are the results of that going to be incorporated into this at all or not going to be utilized?
Um, they're going to be talked about a little bit later in today's presentation. Yes.
Oh, okay. Great. Thanks.
I see we have a mix of new attendees who were not able to participate in the summit yesterday, as well as some like you, Arturo, who were able to attend in person. So we are covering a little bit of the background for everyone, so we all have the same information, the same knowledge, and then we'll open it up for group discussion based on what we learned yesterday and the feedback we're going to get from you today. And not seeing any other hands raised or anything new in the chat, I will go ahead and turn it over to Allison Flewitt so she can walk us through our preliminary funding scenarios. Allison?
Thank you, Taylor. So yes, thanks, Taylor, for teeing that up and setting the stage, because that really brings us to our description of our preliminary funding scenarios. And as Arturo mentioned, these were really where we set the stage with yesterday's summit, outlining these preliminary funding scenarios and set that tone for the conversation that was held yesterday and for the discussion that we'll be having today as well. On the next slide, I do just want to call everybody's attention back to a series of handouts that you all have received. I believe these were provided to all of the participants in today's technical workshop in advance of the meeting. They're also attached to your calendar invitation and were distributed last week. Now, the content that is included in these handouts is largely going to be reflected within the scenario summary slides that we're going to cover here within the next couple of minutes, but they're also a handy reference to look back if you would like additional information. Within these handouts, I'll just call your attention to a few different things that you'll be able to find. And we'll just kind of highlight each one in turn, I think, with a click of the slide. The first being the scenario name and definition. This really gives you the at-a-glance reference of what each of these scenarios comprise and the intent of what was attempted to be achieved with each of these scenarios as we were developing them. Next, we're looking at the annual funding allocation comparison. So the easiest way to demonstrate this, as Taylor was pointing out in her portion of the presentation, is just a quick pie chart comparison. So each one of the handouts will show these in turn. Moving on the handout, we also have our scenario modal categories. So we're able to briefly run through some of those categories that are kind of changing with each one of our scenarios, be those safety, complete streets, TSMO, active transportation, or transit. And there's a bit of a narrative description about each one of those and what you could expect to see contained within those specific to the particular scenario that is being discussed within that handout. Moving on, we also have our relative support to the MTP goals. And we'll look at these specific to each one of our scenarios as we go through the next series of slides. But we wanted to be able to quickly, through a series of gauges here, look at the performance for safety, reliability, connectivity, community, and prosperity. So again, this allows us to link back our scenarios to those goals as we're moving forward. And then finally, we have our scenario outputs. So these are going to be some of the analysis-based facts and figures that actually relate to the scenarios once we think about how a scenario actually would look if we take it all the way through that fiscal constraint exercise. And so this just gives you a little bit of a sense. Some things are going to be measured in different quantities. Some areas are going to be looked at over the entire life of the plan, whereas others may be more easy to really get our heads wrapped around on more of an annual basis. But this is just a helpful guide for us as we go forward. So let's move on from this and just take a look at the scenarios kind of one by one for our illustrative scenarios. And again, these were actually gone through in our summit yesterday. and formed the basis of the discussion that was held during that meeting. So of course, we've begun with our status quo scenario, and Taylor outlined this with you all just a few minutes ago. So we'll just briefly note that this does represent the continuation of our currently adopted funding policy for Metro Plan Orlando. And as we heard, this does already include our modal programs such as Complete Streets, TSMO, Active Transportation, and Transit. Something that is of note is that this scenario does not include a dedicated funding stream for independent safety projects. However, we would expect to note that safety is somewhat inherently contained within some of the other categories as well. So as I mentioned, and you'll see on the next slide, we've taken the opportunity to go all the way through a fiscal constraint exercise with these scenarios to understand what they could actually look like in terms of impact for our region. And you'll see that in a couple of different ways. Looking at some of the numbers on the left, you'll see that this scenario, our status quo, does have a significant number of miles, 29 miles of complete streets projects that are associated with it. We also have 7 new buses on an annual basis that can be obtained. And that's really just thinking about the transit funding that is associated with this scenario. 214 signals can be retimed per year with this allocation that is contained within scenario 1. I'll also note that the safety projects, since we don't have any dedicated safety funding for those independent safety projects, that's why those are showing at 0 for scenario 1. Now, looking over at our gauges for the relative support of the MTP goals, what we wanted to do here was have scenario 1 essentially be our neutral, and then measure all of our other illustrative scenarios against what we're seeing within the status quo. So we'll just move on to scenario 2, and you'll kind of see some of the modulation from more, less, and neutral as we go from there. For our second scenario, we're looking at a safety emphasis. And to do this, we are adding in a funding allocation for independent safety projects. You see that reflected here in that kind of lavender color with a 30% allocation. We also have an increased funding level in this scenario for TSMO projects. But to balance this out, we do see a reduction in funding for active transportation projects as well as transit projects. So balancing this out with scenario 2's performance numbers, we can see on the next slide several different effects of what we have done with some of those funding percentages. So looking at, first off, our safety improvements within this safety-focused scenario, you see with that 30% allocation to independent safety projects that we're able to look over the life of the plan for 23 safety projects on the high injury network and 55 miles of state highway system safety improvements. What we also see are a reduction of miles of complete streets improvements from 29 to 16. Again, that's where you see that funding balancing starting to happen. There's a shift in transit funding allocation here from looking at buses per year to more of a focus on transit stops that can be funded on a per year basis. And other adjustments that you see reflected in here are really just looking at kind of the outcomes of those other tweaks to our funding levels to the new percentages that have been shown. When we pivot over to our gauges, what we see are an enhanced support of safety and connectivity, as well as prosperity. So all of those goals, when looking at the quantitative and qualitative outcomes of these scenarios, do show enhanced support compared to the status quo. Let's move on to scenario 3, which is our TSMO emphasis scenario. And so with scenario 3, we are looking at an increased funding level for our TSMO capital projects. And so that is the green portion of our pie here. So we have a 30% allocation which is $11.6 million on an annual basis. This pie chart does represent the annual funding allocation for each one of these funding sources. I should note that this includes annual set-asides for the traffic signal retiming program and the regional travel data program. Something that's also notable about scenario 3, as well as our subsequent scenarios, is that this includes the funding allocation for independent safety projects as well. So you will see that carried forward in some way, shape, or form through the remainder of our scenarios. To balance what we're seeing within the TSMO emphasis scenario, there is a reduction in funding for complete streets, active transportation, and transit capital projects. So moving on to the scenario 3 performance, we'll just hit on a couple of the notable changes here in comparison to the status quo. So again, with the addition of our safety funding category, we do have an increase in our safety projects and miles, both in the number of projects on the high injury network and our miles of state highway system improvements in comparison to the status quo. We also have a obvious increase in our miles of TSMO improvements. This is actually a doubling, approximately, of our miles of TSMO improvements in comparison to the status quo. So a very notable increase there as well. Also taking a look at our gauges, we have enhanced support of safety, reliability, and connectivity, and then a reduced support for our community goal. So now let's go ahead and move on to our transit emphasis scenario. And for our transit emphasis scenario, one of the notable things here, as we were thinking about that focus, which is a 30% funding level for transit, which you can see in that light blue color, that includes an annual set-aside for transit capital improvements, as well as a dedicated set-aside for transit stop and shelter enhancements. So this is somewhat unique among all of our scenarios in that we are looking at transit in kind of those two different funding buckets as a part of this scenario in particular. I mentioned that that independent safety project category does continue. We do have 20% of our funding level being considered as a part of this scenario as well. And then when you look at the remainder of our funding sources, we do see a reduction in funding when compared to the status quo for complete streets, active transportation, and our TSMO projects. So then let's go ahead and look at our scenario 4 performance, because we want to understand just how this has percolated into our numbers specifically. And I think one of the most notable things that you can see is the new buses per year and the new transit stops per year. We do see that we have 4 new buses per year, as well as 38 new transit stops per year. So we're able to realize improvements in both of those categories because of the way that this particular scenario has been established. We still continue to have those safety improvements with that funding source being established here. As I mentioned, there is a reduction in the total number of complete streets miles when compared to our status quo, as well as our TSMO improvements. Just taking a look at our gauges, we also have, in comparison to our status quo, an increased support of our MTP goals for safety, community, and prosperity for our transit scenario. So then finally, this brings us to our 5th illustrative scenario, which is for restrictive project types. And this scenario is somewhat unique when compared to some of our other scenarios, because we're looking at project types in a couple of different ways that are a little bit different than in others. So just as a couple of examples here, this is our only scenario that actually does include funding to support construction for roadway widening projects. So you can see that yellow category there with 15% of funding going toward widening. That is unique toward this illustrative scenario. We also did look at restricting funding within a couple of the project categories to understand if that would maximize the impact in certain ways. For example, in active transportation, we have limited the funding within that category to only go toward trail projects. And in transit, we have focused that funding to only stop and shelter enhancements. As I mentioned, this does include funding allocation for independent safety projects, and there is a reduction in funding for complete streets, active transportation, TISMO, and transit. So then moving forward into our performance for scenario 5, a couple of things to note here. Again, I mentioned that this is a unique scenario with the inclusion of roadway widening. So you can see kind of at that bottom right of our performance section, we have 6 miles of roadway widening that are anticipated to be accommodated within this scenario over the life of our plan. You can see also in our transit section that we have 38 new transit stops per year that are being considered as our funding is being directed into that funding source. And then again, we're focusing on trails and side paths as part of our active transportation in lieu of consideration of sidewalks. When you think about the performance against goals for our restrictive project type scenario, we did see an improvement in our overall support for safety and prosperity, but lessened support for connectivity and community goals. So moving forward to our next slide, we know we've just kind of run through these fairly quickly, but we did want to get some initial questions, thoughts, and reactions on our illustrative scenarios. So we're hoping to understand if you have any initial questions or thoughts on the illustrative funding scenarios. And these can run the gamut about any of your reactions, likes, dislikes, anything that may have surprised you, or other preliminary questions. And we can start with, I know there's a question in the chat, and I appreciate the patience, about scenario 2. And I believe it was a question specific about the gauges on scenario 2 and just how some of those are calculated. And I can answer that question if that's okay, Taylor.
Yes, of course. I was going to say maybe talk about the how that prosperity one was looked at across multiple scenarios, because it was 4 out of 5 that showed improvements in prosperity of the scenarios compared to the status quo, or 3 out of 5.
That's right, yes. And I think just overall, something perhaps to note about our gauges is that when we're thinking about how we're showing the relative support against our MTP goals, we're really looking at a composite of more of a quantitative process when thinking about the prioritization of maybe the projects that were actually included here, their performance against goals. And then also more of a qualitative aspect of when we're thinking about the funding types that comprise these scenarios and how those relate to the goals that are being considered. So I think that that's what we're seeing, really just more of a blanket statement against each one of these when they're kind of being put together. And as you said, Taylor, what we saw specific to our prosperity goal is that in general, we did not have any of our scenarios that showed a lessened performance against our goals. It was either that neutral or enhanced performance. Anything you would add?
I'd say that's wonderful, Allison. Thank you. And Chad, hopefully that answers your question. If not, please go ahead and continue typing in the chat, and we'll do what we can to clarify. And then there was one other question that came in, and I think this one will go to me, Allison. So at the summit yesterday, one of our in-person attendees was able to sign in this afternoon. Thank you, Charles. So the question is, at the summit, we discussed that safety is typically included in all of our transportation projects. And there's a request to give an example of a safety specific project. So the safety category that's been incorporated into these initial funding scenarios, and everyone, you're welcome to reference the let me see the exact name of it, the handout primer, which is also included in your agenda packets. It's just before the funding scenarios themselves. That defines each of the categories as well, in case you want to see it visually, like I usually do. But the safety component is more of a safety emphasis and kind of funding accelerator type program. So the projects that are currently included under that safety category are those that were identified as part of each of the regional, county, and city Vision Zero action plans and are specifically identified in those plans and are eligible to receive Metro Plan Orlando funding. So that means those projects are located on one of any of those three agencies' high injury networks, and that those projects are on the federal aid eligible network of roads. So it's federally functionally classified as a collector or above, I believe, if my memory is serving me correctly. So those would be all of the examples of the projects that are currently included in that safety category. But I see the underlying component of your question. Yes, we want all of our transportation projects to include the elements to improve our communities, to improve safety. The inclusion of a safety category would be dedicated funding to advance those projects under the that were identified through the Vision Zero action plan process in the event that they could not have been advanced faster through any other mechanism. That's where that came from and why it's been considered. I see that there is one more question, Allison. I'll turn this one over to you. Going back to our gauges, the TISMO emphasis scenario 3, why was the TISMO scenario score lower in community?
Yes,
I
thanks,
think that,
Taylor. And yes, again, kind of thinking back to how some of the elements that tie at a project specific level to prioritization as they relate back to these goals. I think really what we were seeing was just when we went through some of the quantitative scores, maybe how they tied in, we were seeing that's just how kind of some of the scoring would shake out. So I think it may not feel directly intuitive, but again, there's this combination of kind of that qualitative filter that we're putting on things about how does this project type or grouping of project types feel like it would influence our scenario outcomes, and then how do the specific projects themselves and some of the metrics that are coming out of those seem to combine to affect our projects. So again, it's kind of a high level feel. I wouldn't, get super wrapped around the axle out it. It's really just trying to give us that general gauge on where we feel like things are shaking out. Taylor, is there anything that you would add to that?
I think you're answering it perfectly well, Allison. I would just add for everyone's context that the safety, reliability, connectivity, community, and prosperity items are the shorthand versions of our 2050 MTP goals that we developed collaboratively last calendar year. We do have those kind of briefly defined on our handout primer as well. The community section is mostly focused on health and vitality and environmental components. So I did want to kind of emphasize that as well. That's part of the how things are evaluated under these different gauges. It meant to give us a guiding sign. Is this going the direction we want? Yes or no? Do we need to recalibrate, as Allison was mentioning? But I do see we're kind of getting to the point where we need to switch over to our next topic. So thank you so much, Allison. And if there are any additional questions in the chat, we'll do our best to answer those either directly in the chat to respond or coming back to those towards the end of our presentation today. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Allison. I greatly appreciate it. So then moving over to our next section, Alex is going to be summarizing our 2050 MTP Summit and the feedback that we received. And we're going to have some interactive polling discussions as part of Alex's component of the presentation. So have your chat pods ready to go. Alex, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Taylor. We did have one final question from Charlie from Seminole County. Maybe you could help me answer before we move on to next
Oh,
steps. And it
yes.
related to widening. How much is considered a widening? Is going from 2 to 4 lanes widening, or also adding lanes? He provided an example in the chat if everyone can see, if they wanted to make a single left turn into a dual left at an intersection to increase in efficiency. Is this a TISMO project or a widening project? How would you categorize that one, Taylor, based on some of our category parameters?
Perfect. Thank you for catching that one, Alex. I missed that right in the transition. So the widening projects are where it is going from kind of 2 lanes to 4 lanes, 4 lanes to 6, where you're adding that additional capacity. When we're looking at more operational improvements, such as adding a turn lane, extending the length of a turn lane, converting a couple things, those are generally considered geometric improvements, sometimes included as part of complete streets projects. If they're standalone, they're generally considered intersection improvements for inclusion on our TISMO list. So it does get a little nuanced in terms of the specific projects that we're looking at. But kind of a good rule of thumb is, how expensive would it be to implement? Is it more of a quick, easy operations improvement? Think TISMO. Is it more of a corridor revision, kind of corridor plan-esque project that's more complete streets? Or is it complete whole-scale widening because there's a lot going on there for some reason? That would be where it falls into the widening. So if you have specific questions about specific projects, please reach out to me directly and we'll be able to talk through those items. But that's kind of the rule of thumb.
Well said. Thanks, Taylor.
Mhm.
All right, so this next portion of our agenda, I will be 24 hours later providing a little bit of a overview, a thesis of what we heard yesterday, the small group activity itself that has been mentioned a couple times, where the groups landed on average, but also some takeaways, some topics that we're going to talk about in more detail today. So if we go to the next slide, I'll talk about the group activity. And as you saw in the scenarios, the slices of the pie chart, there are many ways to fund our transportation future. And getting away from the pie and finding a tabletop activity, we leveraged the Connect 4 game as an apparatus, and we in small groups, 13 tables of conducted a small group activity, a budgeting exercise. They had the scenarios in front of them, and then we asked them to create their own based on what they heard earlier in the day, similar to what you heard earlier in the day. They had ideas, they had inflection, there was nuance and caveats to many of the topics discussed. But that's what I'll be covering today, talking about that 24 hours later. Obviously, we still need some more time as a team to sort through all of the feedback, and that will come in due time. But at least for now and for today, I'll be talking about what we heard yesterday. But as Taylor mentioned, also asking for your feedback. And about 15, 16 members, about 50% of our group today did participate from our quick review in yesterday. So as I'm having this discussion, please feel free. We'll have prompts, but help us fill in the gaps, add context, especially if you are at one of those tables that we'll be talking about today. So that'd be super helpful. So with that, going into the next slide, please, I will talk about the findings from the game. So as we reported out, each table had to come to consensus on a budget allocation, a modal budget allocation. And as you can see on this slide here, there's a couple extra columns that we offered our players, and we gave them an opportunity to make sure that we could capture other categories that weren't included. And I'll be talking about that here in just a moment. But what we saw was a relatively balanced approach. Safety did remain an emphasis, as did our complete streets category and transit capital. And as you can see on this particular allocation, about 15%, 3 tokens, was allocated to different topics that centered around what we called player's choice. And I'm going to be talking about that here on the next slide, if we could. So again, we had about 15% of the feedback received interrelated to a player's choice category. And as we summed those up from yesterday, we were able to group them currently into what we're calling 8 categories of player choice feedback. So again, 15% of all of our feedback was dispersed into these 8 categories. So, we're talking 2 to 5% across the board. But the intent of my discussion with you today will be to raise each one of these topics, talk about what we heard yesterday. As I mentioned, for those who participated in the discussion, I'll ask you to help fill in some of the gaps, maybe add some context. And for those who aren't able, what are your off the cuff reactions to what you're hearing today, both as it relates to the scenarios, but also to some of the pivot and refinements that you'll see in some of the next slides. So again, 8 topics. We're going to tackle them each one by one. As Taylor mentioned, we'll be using the chat, but also your microphones if you wish. But before we dive into the first topic, I do see a hand raised from Arturo, so I wanted to recognize you. Arturo?
Yeah, thank you, Alex. My question was similar to what I asked yesterday in our table. When it says widen a roadway, is 0 to 2 lanes, is that a widening job, or is it a new lane project or new project, or what are we going to categorize that as?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'll be covering that here in more detail. But right under widening, you'll see new corridor opportunities, and that is, I would say, what was code for those new facilities in some growing areas. So going from 0 to 2 or 0 to 4, whatever that footprint may be. But that was the new road. So as we talk more here in conversation, some of these 8 could be grouped together. But they are nuanced, so we wanted to talk about them individually today to get as much contextualized feedback. But I'll be covering that in a little more detail here in a few slides.
Okay, and now this one that you're showing now, is that like an average of all the tables, Connect 4 boards?
Correct. So we had 13 tables, about 100 participants. And what you see on this slide and the one prior was the average of that. So again,
Did you
we
by any
will be,
chance?
and Taylor will
Oh, sorry.
speak to this more. This is not the end all be all. This is just a very 24-hour,
Yeah.
synthesis of of what happened yesterday. We will be iterating, but some of that next step iteration, if you'll let me get to it, comes from what we heard in these topics, and making sure that we have consensus around the player's choice topics that we heard, since not all tables had played that column, and many varied in which how they allocated as well. But from what you see here on the slide, this is a average of the in-person feedback we received yesterday.
Okay, now there were 13 tables and each table had 20 chips.
That is correct.
So that will be 260 possible entries. So do you have one chart where you added everything, on top of each other, like safety, that there were I don't know, 56 chips and complete streams that were 82 or so forth and so forth?
Yes, we have an Excel file which allowed us to process this into a more visually stimulating graphic.
Okay, great, thank you.
All right, so again, I'm gonna be covering each of these 8 topics one by one, allow us to kind of focus our energies. Again, each of these topics, if you participated yesterday, you may have not heard much about these because they were may have not been brought up at your table. So this is our opportunity. We want to take the opportunity today to talk about each, get your feedback. But know that today's discussion is going to help us further contextualize our next set of iterations, our next set of scenarios, refinement and new that we'll be developing. And we'll talk about that more. But again, the intent of today's technical discussion is to help us build consensus and also to help make sure we're what we hear is what you mean as it relates to these topics. So one that came up at our at one table was to invest to dedicate funding on and for transportation disadvantaged populations. So this could be for access links improvements. This could be based on some of the feedback we received as it relates to access to transit. It could have some pedestrian improvements as well. But again, 24 hours later, this was a player's choice item. I think this amounted to about 2% of that total 15% of feedback we received. But if there's any additional feedback here, reactions to dedicating a portion of our federal urban attributable funds to support transportation disadvantaged eligible activities. And again, if you want to use chat, raise your hand. We'll recognize as many people as we can. Again, we will be covering each of the 8 topics individually. So I'll give this just a moment to let that sink in. I'm seeing some feedback here from Jacques. Thank you so much, concurring with that, given the age and diversity of our population. We have a question in here from Shad about other alternative sources of funding from the CDBG, so the Community Development Block Grant, I believe is what we're referring to. And yes, portions of paratransit service in Central Florida are formula-based through the Access Links program. I believe, and don't let the graphic on the slide mislead you, the improvements centered around not just paratransit service, but also improvements for those vision and hearing impaired. So this could be improved the API, I think, was it the audible pedestrian, excuse me, devices at intersections, could be tactile strips, it could be ADA and PROAG related improvements, capital improvements, but this would have to be capital oriented. Shad, I hope that answers your question and then some. All right, not getting a lot of feedback from y'all, but again, that was a little bit of what we heard yesterday. Before I move on to the next topic, is there any other feedback or questions on this particular item? But yeah, that is a good question for sure. All right, hearing none. And also just, I know this is fresh off the press. These are topics that we'll also be talking to you about at your upcoming advisory committee meetings for those who are our technical and systems management advisory committee members. So with that, if we can go on to the next slide, which I'll be talking about in 2 different slides. I'm going to focus here because we had 2 topics that I think are interrelated. This one here focuses, as it says on the slide, focus funding, dedicate funding for future readiness and prepare for the next generation of mobility. We've conducted Metro plans, and some of this feedback was on developing plans and studies, but also as it related to capital investment. Thoughts, feedback. We recently completed a electric vehicle readiness study. As many of you know, we have conducted similar autonomous and connected vehicle studies in the past. With emerging technologies like advanced air mobility, having kind of regional plans. If that's of interest to the group, seeing that programmatically funded in the planning process. Thoughts, feedback, or if you participated in that group discussion and want to offer additional insights? Do you see?
We have
We have
one
a hand
hand
raised,
raised.
Jacques?
Yep.
Sure. So I think for this, I think it's important that we do look at this from a legislative standpoint. At the state level, they are looking to fund more kind of innovation and future-ready projects for transportation, in particular with AAM, advanced air mobility, and some of those types of things. I think I'll be honest, I haven't looked at it recently, but I know that there's been discussion of ensuring that metropolitan planning organizations like MetroPlan have a role in that. So I think just making sure that we keep an eye on those things, and I truly think MetroPlan has a good role across the region to play. So I'm very supportive of this, but it's kind of, I guess, in my job title too.
Understood. Thanks for that, Jacques. And if we were to move forward with a program of this, we would likely associate it kind of with one of our modal programs and use that as a set aside to fulfill the purpose in guidance with TAC and the TISMO committee moving forward. See, we have a question from Bill. This would be private sector transportation. I would say yes and no. I think Jacques might be the best, and I hate to put you on the spot, Jacques. But I think it varies pending whether it's drone delivery or advanced air mobility or connected or autonomous. And there's likely a role for local government and an MPO or state government to play in the local infrastructure, surface infrastructure of that, but the operational aspect of it would likely be private. Bill, is that along the lines of your question, or I want to make sure we're answering you best. And Jacques, if you want to add anything to that,
Sure.
This is one of those topics that is
Yeah,
with much intrigue.
it is. I agree wholeheartedly. It's both. There is, and some of it is kind of a not a wait and see, but a iterative working together. I will say the North Central Texas Council of Governments does a lot of work on regional cooperation on drones and all of that. There is a need for um, the public sector to kind of the data, the modeling, the multimodal integration is a big part of it. So continuing to see what those impacts are on the ground level, but then also providing, and sometimes it's as simple as just making sure we have the data sources needed available to private companies that are looking to come in, but making sure that we're setting standards across the region that meet our needs as well. So it is a bit of both.
Thanks, Jock. And I think that, again, as I mentioned, this is a topic, if there's of interest of the group, this is something that we're going to continue those discussions in the near future with our TAC and TISMO advisory committees who would oversee those efforts. But we'll go to the next slide. And there's an interrelationship between this and this other topic. But again, it was another column, another player's choice, a separate player's choice item. And that was technology, but centering around TISMO, but with a greater focus on ITS solutions. So different from the example that Charlie mentioned that related to kind of adding a turning lane as an intersection improvement. This was focused more on the technological solutions to add intersection and roadway capacity to kind of improve reliability. So this would be as implemented or could be implemented similar to our corridor and area-wide program where signal and other boxes of different types are replaced. But we see this, or at least 24 hours later, as an opportunity to include as a TISMO emphasis program. But again, discussions that we'll be having with you and our advisory committees over the next couple of months as well. Any initial thoughts on this, especially from any of our TISMO advisory committee members, or if you were the person who raised this at your table yesterday? Give you guys just another couple seconds, just in case you're keying anything in chat. But again, another way of emphasizing the TISMO program. I'm seeing Charlie, thanks for your response. TISMO does this already. Not sure if we need to kind of further categorize the TISMO project list. Shad as well, thank you for your feedback, acknowledging how this and the prior item do blend together. That's good feedback, both from Charlie and Shad. Thank you, gentlemen. All right, we can move on to the next topic. And I think this came up a couple times in different formats. But this was one as Taylor presented as we were developing our 5 scenarios going into the summit. And as you heard earlier, the parameters were not to include dedicated funding for widening. But the feedback we received yesterday was to rethink that, to reconsider that. And it was to reconsider that 2 ways, 1 or 3 ways, really. To widen, going from 2 to 4, it could be the complete streets element where you're widening, going, let's say 2 to 4, and you're, improving, adding continuous sidewalk or side path or other safety improvements. Or the third, this is that new corridor. What if you're going from 0 to 2 or 0 to 4, a new roadway facility? So this is a topic, again, that was raised and that we want to get additional feedback on today, and we'll be asking again our advisors here at their coming meetings as well. But what are your reactions to adding a portion of the urban attributable funds for widening and new road construction? Go ahead and use the chat, or again, if anyone has any questions and wants to speak aloud, you're more than welcome rather to raise your hand, and we'll recognize you and have the mic unmuted.
I don't know if I can find how to raise hand. Can you hear me?
Christina, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry.
No
I
worries.
mean, this one I'm definitely on the fence, on about. I kind of waffle a little bit. And I'm, advocating for Osceola County, who has, booming population, and widening and new corridor projects is definitely something that we need. But, when I just think about you know, I think somebody had mentioned yesterday, 46 million. That was what we've got to work with. And if it goes towards widening and new corridor projects, that's not going to go very far. And I think that was in one of your scenarios as well, in scenario 5. So that just leads me towards not necessarily wanting um, the widening and new corridor projects to be a focus area for these particular funds. And I do think that the $46 million and some of these other categories that we have um, can help support these types of projects, or kind of help fill in, let's say, active transportation or safety on widening and new corridor projects. But um, for the actual use of the funds for widening and new corridors, it's not going to get us very far.
Thank you for your feedback, Christina. And we also heard in chat from Brian acknowledging that road widening projects should be funded by local agencies, and also calling to attention that given the cost of a widening project or a new road construction project, that so many other projects could likely be funded as well. So that is another consideration, the balancing of what can be accomplished and what funds are available to accomplish those transportation needs. This is good feedback here. This was again a topic that many of our partners, I would say at most tables, were on the fence on. It came up in many of the discussions as a player's choice. Whether the chip was leveraged, I think is another discussion. So, but we'll talk more about that at our technical advisory committee meeting as well. So, good feedback here today. Keeping things moving, we'll go on to our next topic, kind of the opposite end, I would say, of the investment spectrum. And this is a little bit of a change from our transit capital, or a pivot from our our existing historic transit capital program. This particular program wanted to expand that for rail expansion, as our local partners take over the financial aspects of Sunrail and operations. Could those funds be leveraged for Sunrail eligible capital expenses or the development of other rail connectivity in the region? And the eligibility answer is yes. The question is that something that is the will of the group? Taking a portion of our urban attributable funds and using them for eligible rail capital related improvements. So that could be for locomotives and coaches and stop improvements and things of that nature, building a station, things of that nature. Again, a topic raised and one that we want to get your feedback on today. So
I was at a table where this came up. It wasn't specifically like new rail opportunities, but what we're talking about is for players' choice, calling it sort of leverage funds. For example, like new rail opportunities, where the funds wouldn't be for, let's say, the construction or implementation of something like this, but it would be sort of starter money to do, a study that would have like a regional impact. And this kind of rail opportunity was an example of that. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but
I know we do have the leverage fund as a separate topic, so I think that may have been at a different table.
okay.
Christina, so we and again, that's kind of the interesting part of the exercise is we played the game, a consistent game with 13 different tables, and we each came out with unique findings, both in discussion and quantitatively reported. So, but yeah, from my understanding and from what I'm seeing, that was from a separate table. But we will bring up that what we're calling the leverage funding opportunities topic, because we do want to make sure that we understand that one very clearly as we try to frame that one out a little bit more. So I'll bring that one up here in just a couple minutes.
Okay.
Thanks. Seeing also some feedback in the chat that the costs of rail are very high and can't, considering the limited finite federal funding that we have and that we're speaking to, how far that will take us, kind of similar to along the same lines of the widening discussion. Then we're also seeing feedback that that funding could benefit the local partners for Sunrail, for Brightline, and for other needs. Well, actually, I may have apologized. I apologize, Brian, if I misrepresented that. It's actually to keep. Is it to keep? Would you suggest keeping funding not for those, or to leverage these limited funds for those types of investments? I apologize if I
Yeah,
was your feedback.
yeah, it was the opposite of what you first said. Is that, you know, if we use our funding for Sunrail, it could potentially benefit others outside of the MPO benefit area. Okay, as well as potentially Brightline. Brightline has a stake in the Sunshine Corridor, so just need to be careful that we focus our funding on the benefits of within the Tri-County area.
Well said, understood. And I appreciate that. And again, part of the reason we want to kind of raise these topics as we're moving forward is to make sure that we're all on the same page in next steps. So, Brian, I appreciate that for the clarification. Thank you for your feedback. Right, hearing consistent feedback on that topic. Why don't we move on to a totally separate item? And it's something that has come up during our Vision Zero planning exercise. That the importance of public education, both for awareness of opportunities, the impacts and benefits of transportation, but also the importance of public education for behavioral change, non-infrastructure countermeasures. So this, again, an important one. Funding is eligible. There are other ways to accomplish this, as to answer the question as it relates to kind of funding logistics. But something that we have heard come up on multiple occasions, and it was raised yesterday as well. So any reactions or additional feedback if that came from your table yesterday? Thanks, Doug. I'm seeing some feedback in chat here. Also, the importance of letting the public know of the success of projects, similar to our before and after for our signal retiming work, kind of calling attentions to the good stuff. But also calling attention to the behavioral change needs. Jacques, again, seeing your comment, while I like this item, I think there are a lot of other areas where, in ways that we can reach out to the public. It can be a part of this type of funding, can be part of the overall project, but maybe not a dedicated funding program per se. Any other thoughts, reflections on this particular one? It is very different. I think that it gives us direction, irregardless of it becoming a funding slice. Just the general need for improved and enhanced engagement and education. So I think this is one that we can take to heart, irregardless of it becoming a slice of the pie per se. All right, moving on to 8 of 8 here, and this is the one Christina mentioned just a moment ago, and this is the leverage funding, or we're calling the leverage funding opportunities, and that was to increase flexibility in our planning and programming process for federal funds. This one, if implemented as part of the MTP, would be kind of like a set-aside funding program, as you see noted here. A lot of the parameters of the analysis would be determined, or excuse me, the parameters of the funding program would be determined later by our technical advisory committee. But our takeaway from the discussion and feedback initially was this leverage funding opportunity. The leverage would be leveraging the local funds and finding a match for federal funds in years appropriate. So this was one. It's doable. It will require coordination, with our partners, downstream, especially our technical advisory committee and local agencies. But want to get feedback from the group beyond planning studies. Is there appetite for setting aside funds in the MTP to be leveraged by local funds? And if Christina, if you want to add, or others, there may be some others who may have been at that table. I don't want to put you on the spot necessarily, who want to kind of provide additional context, maybe fill in the gaps a little bit more on this one.
Yeah, so I think it was the new rail type thing was an example brought up, but it would be, some initiative or something that we would collectively have, for our whole area that would, we know we would not have the funding to implement and construct, but it could be, a study that we do with these funds that then lead us towards being able to secure, some kind of bigger grant for another phase or whatnot. I don't know exactly how, like, the Vision Zero stuff came about. That might be, a small example or one example where we all kind of banded together, right? And somehow we had these funds to do, our action plans. And now we're going to take those and we're going to, divide and conquer to get, additional funding or maximize whatever opportunities we can to do next phases of study, design, or whatnot. But that sort of starter fund or leverage fund around something that we all, think will make a big difference is there, and we can use it and, kind of get us started to being able to leverage other funding opportunities.
I see where you're going with this, and just to kind of give some context, our Vision Zero work, but before we were calling it Vision Zero, we were calling it Vulnerable User Safety Action Planning work. So a lot of those efforts and the reason we were able to kind of pivot and grow the program so quickly is we had that existing group, kind of that long-standing focused effort, and then the money came available, and we were able to kind of act based on some initial direction that group had given us. As it relates to this topic, I want to make sure we're understanding it correctly. Is it identifying or conducting studies, planning studies to understand regional opportunities and benefits, or is it setting funding aside for those projects to be constructed by
No,
a local? Because that's where I
it's
want to
not the
make sure that
latter.
there's a big
Yeah, it's not the
position.
latter. We're
Okay.
thinking, at our table, we were thinking, hey, there's these, these pretty, cool, transformative things that come about. And not to say that the MPO funds have to, we've got to cobble together over 20 years trying to cobble together money like MPO funds to implement them. But what we need is the MPO funds to, be the spark, to do the action plan, to do the maybe a PD&E for, again, one of those new rail corridors or something like that, that then we leverage that to go for bigger grants, other funding opportunities, other, partnership and stakeholder participation and things like that.
Thanks, Christina. In chat, I'm seeing both ends of the feedback spectrum, positive and critical, as it relates to this particular one. Does anyone else have any insights, reactions, thoughts as it relates to this last? This is 8 of 8. So this is our last short form item here. So any other feedback on this particular topic? Again, we will be bringing these back up to you, but wanted to make the most of our time together today. All right, hearing none, I'll go to the kind of this last call, final thoughts. You know, I know we covered a lot of ground, both on the initial 5 scenarios, kind of the iterations, reflections, kind of 24-hour thoughts 24 hours later. But we wanted to kind of take this pause here, and again, hear from our partners, those who participated yesterday, but also maybe from some of those who are hearing a lot of this for the first time today. Not seeing any hands, not seeing any bubbles in the chat. Give it just another second for any final questions or thoughts about any of the funding policy topics that we covered today. All right, hearing none, I appreciate y'all's feedback today. Again, we're going to be iterating through this, but context helps, and we'll be able to work from that. So I appreciate your time this afternoon. I'll hand things back over to Taylor to wrap up.
Thank you so much, Alex, for guiding us through that. I greatly appreciate it. So as Alex was indicating, we do have some next steps following the summit yesterday, this afternoon's conversation, and additional clarifications and additional feedback we've received. So we're going to take all of the feedback that we've received to date and kind of deep dive that information, synthesize it a bit more clearly. You got the 24-hour quick version today. But we're going to do a deeper dive to develop some proposed actions based on what we've learned to be able to make some revisions to these proposed funding scenarios. So eliminate the ones that are not working for us as a region and dive a little bit deeper and refine into the funding scenarios that we do see that are a little more palatable, closer to the right direction we should be traveling. So more information will be presented about that at our upcoming advisory committee and board meetings throughout the April and May cycle. And once we have some consensus on those proposed actions, then we'll implement those and develop the next iteration of funding scenarios. A few other items coming soon. I preluded these at the beginning of the meeting, but we will be reaching out to each of our government agency partners and our transportation operating partners to work on those planning consistency project needs lists. So that all the projects that are not currently included within the 2050 Metropolitan Transportation Plan's needs assessment, the projects that aren't eligible for MPO funding, we do want to make sure those projects are included for planning consistency purposes. So you'll be hearing from us pretty soon to get that process started. And then also we had a couple questions come up about which projects are where in the plan. So in terms of our needs assessment, that online dashboard that we mentioned earlier at the beginning of the meeting, that will include the full list visualized on a ArcGIS online platform to be able to look at where all those projects are located, what they are, how they've been preliminarily categorized based on the first set of potential categories. That could change depending on how the funding policy evolves. But you'll be able to see where they stand now, make sure the projects are included that we've discussed throughout the entire needs assessment process throughout 2024, and you'll be able to see those raw priority scores based on that prioritization methodology. So as soon as that goes online on our website, we'll be able to let you know so you can dive into that information and take a look yourself. And overall, to let you know where we are kind of kicking off and kind of deep diving all of this funding scenario evaluations here. And we're going to be doing that for the rest of this quarter and then working towards building that consensus to be able to dive into our cost feasible plan development once we have a recommended funding policy to move forward with. We are on track to be able to complete both of those activities and have a completed plan by December of this year for our adoption. And I did see a question that was coming up on the chat. So Arturo, the MTP online dashboard that I'm referring to is going to be a public-facing one published on our website. What you have a link to is that iterative draft version that we were using for the needs assessment development. So that will be different and it will have much more features and functionality than that internal document, internal version that we've been using for the development of the needs assessment process. So with that, I kind of jumped ahead. Are there any other final questions, comments, items that you need to bring up as a group? I'll wait a moment here, see if there are any hands that are raised or any new comments in the chat. All right, glad we got your question answered, Arturo. Saw that in the chat. Not seeing anything else raised, I will go ahead and open it up for public comment. So if there are any members of the public who are attending this meeting, if you could please raise your hand to indicate you'd like to make a comment. We do ask that you limit your comment to 2 minutes. And I'm not seeing any hands raised for this section either. So if you would like to make a comment, you're welcome to also email us after the meeting today at mtp@metroplanorlando.gov. So with that, just a quick look ahead, what's coming next. So we've mentioned a few upcoming action items for our advisory committee and board members, but for all of you attending today, our next technical workshop, number 9 of this series, will be June 12th, again at 2 p.m. The one following that will be in August 14th, also at 2 p.m. and virtual. You'll be receiving calendar holds for both of these items in the coming weeks. So you can reserve the time on your calendars and be ready for another very fruitful discussion. So with that, thank you so much, everyone, for attending this afternoon and participating and sharing your thoughts with us on these kind of early themes for what we'll be using to develop refinements to our funding scenarios. We greatly appreciate it. I hope you all have a great afternoon, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.